The day Renwick Osei Boateng turned 22, he didn't get a cake. He got an eviction notice slipped under the door of the basement suite he shared with his uncle in Brampton, and a voicemail from the parts warehouse on Airport Road telling him not to come back Monday, both in the same afternoon. He sat on the edge of his cot, the same folding cot he'd slept on since his mother sent him up from Accra 4 years ago, and stared at the two pieces of bad news like they were a pair of old boots, worn through, nothing left to them. His uncle, Kwame, came home around 6, took one look at the notice, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You have until the 15th. That was the birthday. Renwick. Most people called him Ren, though his mother still used the full name whenever she called on Sunday mornings, her voice crackling over the bad connection. Had spent the last 2 years working the stockroom at Halton Auto Parts. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't supposed to be. He'd taken the job because it was the only place that called him back, and he'd learned more in those 2 years than he ever expected. Which bearings wore fastest on which models, which distributors were reliable and which ones shipped garbage and hoped you didn't notice until the return window closed. He knew the smell of brake dust the way a baker knows flour. He'd also been quietly fixing cars on weekends out of Kwame's driveway. Nothing official. A neighbor's Civic with a bent rocker arm. A woman from church whose Elantra kept stalling at red lights. Word got around the way it does in immigrant communities. Carefully, with personal recommendations, one phone number passed hand to hand. He charged less than the shops in Mississauga, and he didn't cut corners, and for a while that was enough. Then the warehouse let him go. The official reason was restructuring. The unofficial reason, the one Ren understood when his supervisor, a man named Dale Vickers, avoided eye contact during the whole conversation, was that Dale had hired his nephew for the position, and there was only room for one of them. Dale Vickers had worked at Halton Auto Parts for 11 years and had never once learned that Ren pronounced his own last name Osei Boateng, and this had never seemed to bother Dale at all. So Ren had $43 in his account, 2 weeks to find somewhere to live, and no job. What he also had, though he didn't fully understand this yet, was 3 years of favors owed, a reputation for honest work, and a specific kind of stubbornness that looks, from the outside, like stupidity, until suddenly it doesn't. He found the listing by accident. He'd been using the public computers at the Brampton Civic Library, scrolling through Kijiji for basement apartments he couldn't afford, when a different listing caught his eye. Not an apartment. A property, a detached garage on a dead-end lane off Chrysler Drive in Cambridge, listed under commercial space as is. The photos showed a cinder block building maybe 30 feet deep, a rusted roll-up door, a cracked concrete floor with motor oil stained into it like a birthmark. Weeds growing through a gap in the foundation, a single bare bulb hanging from a wire. The asking price was $2,200 a month, but there was a note at the bottom. Owner will consider purchase offer. Motivated to close. Ren stared at that phrase, motivated to close, for a long time. He called the number. The man who answered was named Gareth Sinclair Booth. He introduced himself quickly, the way people do when they're used to being in a hurry, and explained that the garage had belonged to his father, who had passed away in February, and that the estate was being settled, and that he personally had no interest in maintaining a commercial property in Cambridge while he lived in North Vancouver. His voice carried that particular flatness of someone who has already calculated the value of everything being discussed and found it low. "What are you looking to pay?" Gareth Sinclair Booth said. Not a question, a prompt. Ren had been up the night before doing the math on a piece of paper he'd torn from a library notepad. He had $43. He had a tax return he hadn't filed yet, maybe $800 if he was. He had a friend named Bertram Asante who owed him $600 from a transmission job Ren had done on credit 9 months ago. "I can do $1,200, Ren said. There was a silence. Not a long one, but the kind that has weight. "It's worth considerably more than that," Gareth Sinclair Booth said. "I know," Ren said, "but you're in North Vancouver, and I'm the one calling." Another silence. "Come see it," Gareth said, "if you can get here by Saturday." Ren borrowed Kwame's car, a 2009 Malibu with a shimmy in the front left wheel that Ren had been meaning to fix for months. and drove to Cambridge on a Thursday morning in late March. The sky was that particular shade of Ontario gray that doesn't commit to anything. Not rain, not sun, just a cold flat light that makes every building look like it was built as a temporary measure. The garage was on a lane called Fillmore Court, wedged between a chain-link fence and an empty lot where someone had dumped a couch. There were 2 other units on the lane, a welding operation on one end and what appeared to be a tire storage business on the other. The roll-up door to the garage was padlocked. Ren walked around the perimeter twice before Gareth Sinclair Booth arrived, which he did at 11:17 in a rented Nissan, wearing a vest that was too thin for the weather. Gareth was in his mid-50s with the kind of tan you only get from actual West Coast winters, not dark, just not as gray as everyone else. He unlocked the door and stood back, watching Ren walk in. The garage was a mess. Not catastrophically. No collapsed ceiling, no standing water, but the kind of accumulated neglect that comes from a decade of using a space for storage rather than its intended purpose. Someone had left 3 car seats stacked in the corner. There was a folding table with a cracked leg. The old hydraulic lift was still there, bolted to the floor, and when Ren went to look at it, Gareth made a sound. "I wouldn't trust that," Gareth said. "My father stopped using it around 2015. Probably needs to be scrapped." Ren crouched beside the lift base and ran his hand along the cylinder housing. He didn't say anything. "Wiring is original," Gareth continued. "I had someone come look at it. It's functional, but you'd want to update the panel before you ran any serious equipment." He paused. "Honestly, the building has good bones. It's just been sitting. How long since anyone used it as a garage? 7 years, maybe 8. Ren stood up and looked at the ceiling. Steel joists, solid, and then at the floor, which was cracked in 3 places but level. The oil stains were deep, which meant years of actual work. Someone had cared about this space once. "Who was your father?" Ren asked. Gareth seemed slightly surprised by the question. He ran an auto restoration business. Hobbyist, mostly, later on. He did good work. He said this with a strange mixture of pride and distance, the way you talk about someone you didn't understand while they were alive. "I'll give you 1,500, Ren said. "That's everything I can put together." Gareth looked at him for a moment. He looked at the garage. He looked at the couch on the lot next door, visible through the open door. "That lift alone is worth more than that if someone can get it working," Gareth said. "I know," Ren said. "That's why I offered what I did, not less." There was something in that answer that seemed to land differently than Gareth expected. He was quiet for a bit. Then he said, "I have someone else interested." "Okay," Ren said. "They're offering 18. "That's a better offer," Ren said simply. Gareth looked at him again. "What would you do with it?" "Fix cars." "Same as your father." Gareth stood there another moment, then he said, 15.5. "I need to cover the estate filing fees." Ren's tax return came back at $820. Bertram paid him $600 reluctantly, in 3 installments over 2 weeks. He sold his laptop, his actual laptop, which he used for everything, for $240 to a student in Waterloo. He borrowed $300 from a woman from his mother's church, a retired Ghanaian nurse named Agnes, who pressed the bills into his hand and said, "You pay me back when you can, not before," in a way that made it impossible to argue. He came up with $1,540. He called Gareth back. "I'm 20 short," he said. Gareth was quiet for a second. "Don't worry about the 20, he said. "Moving in, if you could call it that, happened on the 1st of April. Ren loaded Kwame's Malibu with a sleeping bag, a toolbox, 2 sets of coveralls, a portable space heater, and a cooler with food from Kwame's kitchen. Kwame watched him pack without saying much. At the end, he handed Ren a bag with jollof and a container of stew and said, "Don't freeze to death." The garage had no bathroom. There was a tap near the back wall, cold water only, and a drain in the floor. For the first 3 weeks, Ren used the bathroom at the Tim Hortons 4 blocks away. He kept his sleeping bag in the office corner, a partitioned area in the back maybe 8 by 8 feet, and ran the space heater on low through the night. He had told almost no one what he was doing, which was by design. The people who needed to know would find out when there was something to find out. Everyone else would offer advice, and the advice would be well-meaning and useless, and Ren didn't have time for either. The first 2 weeks were spent on the space itself. He swept and mopped the floor 3 times. He replaced 2 fluorescent fixtures with LED strips he found on sale at Home Depot. He borrowed a pressure washer from the welding shop next door. The operator was a quiet Ukrainian man named Pavel who nodded when Ren explained what he was doing and asked for nothing in return, and blasted the concrete until the black oil stains lightened to gray. The lift was his biggest project. He sourced a repair manual online, printed it at the library, and spent 4 evenings going through the hydraulic system. 2 seals were cracked. The control valve was gummed up with old fluid. He ordered the parts from an industrial supplier in Hamilton, $147, which he put on a prepaid card he'd loaded with his last spending money, and spent a Saturday afternoon replacing them. When he ran the lift for the first time and it rose smoothly and held, he stood back and felt something he didn't have a name for. Not pride exactly, more like proof. He registered the business in May. OC Auto Works. Simple. He paid the $60 Ontario business registration fee and made a single social media page. Just a name, a phone number, a photo of the clean floor and the working lift. The first customer came because of Pavel. Pavel had mentioned to the tire storage guys next door that the young man in the old Sinclair Booth garage was good with cars. The tire storage guys, 2 brothers, Lev and Dmitri, had a fleet van that had been sitting for 6 weeks waiting for a diesel diagnostic appointment at a dealership. The dealership had a 2-month backlog. Lev knocked on Ren's roll-up door on a Wednesday morning and asked if he could look at it. Ren spent 40 minutes with the van. Fuel injector issue, nothing dramatic, but it had been misdiagnosed by someone before, and the wrong part had been replaced. He had the correct component in stock. It happened to be one he'd sourced for another job that had fallen through. He fixed it in 3 hours, charged $180 in labor, and was honest about the part cost. Lev called his cousin, who called his mechanic, who was apparently not his mechanic anymore because he'd moved to Edmonton, and Ren got 2 more bookings by the end of the week. This was how it started. Not with a moment, not with a revelation. Just work, accumulating, the way money does when you don't spend it and the way reputation does when you don't squander it. By July, Ren was covering rent on a shared house on the east side of Cambridge. He'd found a room for $650 a month through a mutual connection, a Ghanaian-Canadian family who had space after their eldest moved out. And he was booking about 3 to 4 jobs a week. Not enough to be comfortable, enough to keep going. He was also learning, in real time, the parts of owning a business that no one thinks to tell you. Invoicing, taxes, the specific social physics of getting people to pay on time without making them feel accused of something. He made mistakes. He undercharged for a transmission rebuild that took him 22 hours. He overestimated his capacity in September and double-booked 2 customers who both needed weekend work. And he had to have an uncomfortable conversation he handled badly and then better, and then badly again before it was over. He did not, in those months, have a mentor. He had YouTube and the manuals he printed at the library, and occasionally the older mechanic who ran a licensed shop on the other side of Cambridge, a man named Willard Fenton, who had at some point decided that Ren was not competition, and was in fact worth a phone call when something unusual came through. Willard was 63, stubborn about paperwork, and had been in the trade for 40 years. He didn't give Ren advice unprompted. But when Ren called, he answered, and he didn't condescend, which was worth more than most people understood. In October, a man named Craig Sutherland came in. Sutherland was in his late 40s, broad, with the particular posture of someone who has spent a long time being the most important person in most rooms he enters. He drove a Range Rover and he spoke to Ren the way some people do when they've decided, before the conversation starts, that the person they're speaking to is a service, not a person. He had a classic car, a 1972 Chevelle SS, that he was having shipped from a storage unit in Barrie, and he wanted it restored. Not maintenance, restoration. He'd gotten quotes from 3 shops, and all of them were, in his words, insane. He wanted to know what Ren could do. Ren asked to see photos and a condition report. Sutherland sent them from his phone while still standing in the garage. Ren looked through them carefully without rushing, and Sutherland did not appear to be comfortable with this pace. "It's going to need full body work on the rear quarter," Ren said. "Mechanical restoration throughout, probably a repaint if you want show quality. We're talking months of work if it's done right. What's done right cost?" Ren gave him a number. Sutherland laughed, not meanly but dismissively, which is sometimes worse. "Son," Sutherland said, "I'm not going to pay you what I'd pay a proper restoration shop. You're working out of a cinder block box in Cambridge." Ren looked at him for a moment. "That's true," he said. "And everything I quoted you is what the work actually costs, regardless of the building. If you want to find someone cheaper, I'd encourage you to do that." Sutherland seemed momentarily unsettled. He'd expected either a fight or a capitulation, and gotten neither. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was 16, Ren said. "Professionally, since May. Sutherland said this like he was tasting something strange. "You've been open 5 months." "Yes." Sutherland looked around the garage, the lift, the clean floor. The organized tool wall Ren had built from pegboard and steel hooks he'd scavenged and repainted. He looked at the Chevrolet C10 that was up on the lift, mid-restoration, for a customer in Guelph. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the C10. Ren told him. The history of the truck, the scope of the work, what had been done and what remained. He didn't embellish. He just described it the way he would describe anything he understood. Sutherland left without committing to anything. Ren cleaned his tools and moved on. 3 days later, Sutherland called and booked the Chevelle. The restoration took 4 months. It was the hardest job Ren had done to that point, not because of any single obstacle, but because of the cumulative weight of the details. Sutherland was, as a client, difficult in ways that were almost instructive. He changed his mind about the paint color twice, asked for weekly updates, and showed up unannounced on a Sunday morning to check progress, which was the kind of move that Ren filed away as something he'd need a policy about. But he also paid his invoices within 48 hours, every time without being asked, which in Ren's experience put him ahead of a significant portion of the adult population. The Chevelle was finished in February. Ren drove it to the end of Fillmore Court and back, which was as far as he could take it without plates, and it drove the way a properly restored car drives, with a seriousness, a settled gravity, like something that has been reminded of its own purpose. He sent Sutherland photos. Sutherland arrived the next morning. He walked around the car for a long time without speaking. He crouched and looked at the door gaps, a restorer's habit, a way of checking precision, and he opened the hood and stood there, and then he closed it. "I owe you an apology," Sutherland said. Ren was wiping down a wrench and did not look up immediately. "You paid your invoices on time and didn't ask me to cut corners. That's more than I can say for some clients." "That's not what I mean." Sutherland paused. "What I said when I came in. About the cinder block box. I know what you meant," Ren said. "I shouldn't have said it." Ren looked at him then. Sutherland was not a man who appeared to apologize often. It sat on him awkwardly, like a shirt he didn't buy for himself. But he seemed to mean it, which mattered more than the awkwardness. "I appreciate that," Ren said. Sutherland drove the Chevelle home and, within the week, had told 4 people in his car club about OC Auto Works. 2 of them booked jobs within a month. One of them, a retired professor named Leonard Achterberg, who was building a '69 Mustang from a shell, became Ren's most reliable long-term client, a meticulous and genuinely knowledgeable man who paid promptly, asked good questions, and brought coffee on the days he came to check progress. By the following spring, 14 months after the garage became his, Ren had 3 ongoing restoration projects, a wait list for standard mechanical work that ran 6 to 8 weeks, and was making enough that he was no longer calculating whether he could afford groceries before filling up on supplies. He also had a second lift. He'd found it at an estate auction in Brantford, a 2-post unit in good condition, and he'd borrowed Lev's flatbed to pick it up and paid Bertram Asante, who had repaid his debt and then some, to help him get it through the roll-up door. It took 4 hours and they nearly dropped it twice, and afterward they sat on the floor of the garage and ate the rice and stew Bertram's wife had sent, and Ren thought about the folding cot, the $43, the birthday with the eviction notice. He'd paid Agnes back in September, the full $300, plus a bottle of the palm wine she liked from the Ghanaian grocery on Hurontario. She'd accepted both without comment, which was exactly what he'd expected and exactly what he'd needed. He hired his first employee in June. Kwame's son, Ren's cousin, Deshaun, who was 19 and good with his hands and had been asking to come work at the shop since the previous winter. Ren interviewed him properly, the same way he'd been interviewed, or had tried to be, at Halton Auto Parts. He made a list of expectations. He set a wage and paid it on time. He thought about Dale Vickers and his nephew, and he understood for the first time why that kind of thing happens, and understood that understanding it was not the same as accepting it. What he told Deshaun on the first morning, standing in the garage that smelled by then like work. Like good, real, earned work. You're here because you're good enough to be here. That's the only reason I hire anyone. Don't make me regret it, and I won't make you regret it. Deshaun didn't say much. He nodded, pulled on his coveralls, and got to work. On a Tuesday in August, 14 months and 12 days after Ren signed the papers on Fillmore Court, he got a phone call from a man named Wesley Price. Wesley Price was the operations director at a corporate fleet company out of Kitchener. About 30 vehicles, mostly pickup trucks and cargo vans, used by a building contractor. Their current service garage had closed with 3 weeks' notice. They needed a new maintenance contract, and a man named Leonard Achterberg had given Wesley Price Ren's number. They talked for 40 minutes. Ren asked as many questions as Wesley did, which seemed to catch Wesley slightly off guard. At the end of the call, Wesley said he'd need to come see the space. He came 2 days later. He brought his operations assistant, a young woman named Nadia, who took careful notes and didn't pretend to be anything other than competent. Ren showed them the shop. Both lifts, the tool inventory, the diagnostic equipment. He'd invested in a professional-grade scan tool over the winter, a purchase he'd agonized about for 6 weeks before pulling the trigger. He showed them his logbook, which he kept by hand, every job, every part, every hour. He'd started this before anyone told him to, because it was how his father had run the small repairs he'd done on the side in Accra. And Ren saw no reason to change something that worked. Wesley Price looked at the logbook for a long time. "You're very organized for a one-bay operation," he said. "2 bays now," Ren said. And yes, the contract took 6 weeks to negotiate and sign. It was in the language of numbers, the largest thing Ren had ever put his name on. It was also, in the language of what it meant, the moment the question stopped being whether OC Auto Works would survive and started being something else, something more demanding, more complicated. More his. There are people who will look at this and try to find the trick, the secret, the moment where luck entered the equation and did the real work. Here it is. The lift was functional, which saved him $3,000 in equipment costs in the first 6 months. Pavel mentioned him to Lev at the right time. Leonard Achterberg happened to know Wesley Price. Those are real. Luck is real, and anyone who tells you otherwise is usually someone who's had a lot of it and prefers not to think about that too carefully. But Dale Vickers hired his nephew, and Ren had $43 on his birthday, and the garage on Fillmore Court looked, the first time you walked into it, like the end of something. What Ren did, and this is the part that doesn't get credited correctly, was decide that the things working against him were not the most important things in the room. Not because they weren't real, they were real. The condescension was real, the thin starting capital was real. The cold nights with the space heater were real, the bathroom at Tim Hortons was real. He knew they were real. He just refused to let them be the loudest thing. That's not a motivational poster. That's a daily decision made with no applause in a cold garage in Cambridge, while the gray Ontario sky went on being gray. Some things only make sense once they're already done. You can't explain a lift that holds until you've felt the hydraulics catch. You can't explain a reputation until it walks in the door wearing someone else's name. Renwick Osei Boateng knows this now. He knew it then, too, somewhere in the back of himself where the stubborn parts live. He just had to stay in the building long enough for it to matter.